Meet other folks who love these same truths and or are coming to these same things, and it's wonderful. We on 21st, the most interesting thing to me, we began that effort about 7 years ago, and I really anticipated, I told Anthony this, I anticipated that because of the nature of the work that we were doing there, that we would just receive all sorts of flack and terrible comments and all that sort of thing. It has been surprising to me that I would say we've had comparatively little of that compared to the numbers of people that we hear from who are so excited about these truths, so excited about good things that are happening. And sometimes we hear, actually almost regularly we hear from people who are now coming to this understanding for the first time and saying, I'm seeing this, or they've been seeing it, and now they're gaining affirmation. They're saying, I thought I was alone here, but I'm not. And so it's great to reach out. We are, you might look for this, for the first time in 7 years, we launched this in part by inspiration from Anthony, and but when we started it, we developed it, we wanted it to be a very visual site. And 7 years ago, visualness was less the norm than it is today. But anyway, in 7 years, we've not really made any major revisions to the site, but we have a new site coming up. Already been working on it for quite some time. But probably late fall, maybe by the first of this coming year, you'll be able to tune us in, and I think you'll enjoy things, and hopefully you'll catch up to us then and see our new site. But we're excited about it. We've been enjoying speaking to people, talking to people here and there, and so we're the book that I introduced last year here. I keep hearing from folks, and they seem to be being benefited from that, so that's great. Very excited about Keegan Chandler's book, and we're happy about that and promoting it as we go along. And if I say this, if you can only get one book that you don't have already, get Anthony's translation. I think that it's so worthwhile and valuable, and we're just talking about that and promoting it everywhere we go because I think it's such a valuable work. And the translation is great. I enjoy it very much. It's now the translation Sharon reads in her morning devotions, but I think, but I love all the notes, and the commentary is just tremendous. So you've just got to have a copy of this book if you don't already have one, and but that just needs to be in everybody's library, and I can't say enough about that. Well, this year I thought I might do something different, a little more relaxed, so to speak. So this will not be one of our tougher sessions, I'll say that. But I hope you'll find it an enjoyable session. I've enjoyed thinking about some of the things that we will talk about here. It is the case that history gives us context to our lives, I think. And actually none of us exist in a vacuum. We know that from our own religious experiences and backgrounds. Some of you come from other backgrounds other than myself and so on. But you exist in that context. You're obviously gaining ground or growing if you have moved along as I have from my original theology, if you will, to what I now find works so much better for me and has strengthened and benefited my faith. And I'm so blessed to be in this understanding of the one true God, Jesus as the true Messiah, God's true human Son, if we say that. And then these other wonderful things about the kingdom of God and so on. All of this is so good. And so I've never looked back for a minute. I look back and say, you know, I'm thankful God brought me maybe the way He did. I can see good to that. But on the other hand, I'm sure glad He brought me to where He did. And I still try to remain open to the Word of the Lord and to teaching and what others may have to say. I think that's very important. And we benefit and gain from one another in that regard. And we need one another. Am I right? We really do. We need that insight that comes from our fellows. And I think that's so important. And that's why a conference like this is so valuable and important to us. And you can kind of go back and feast all the rest of the year over things that you may have heard here, benefited from. And take my thought. I went to a program many, many years ago when I was a young fellow. And but I still remember the speaker saying, I hope you'll get something new out of what I'm saying. But he said, I go to programs and I go to things, and even if I'm already familiar with the material, I'm always expecting to receive something different, something new that will benefit me. And I've always remembered that. So as you go through the next couple of days here, keep that in mind, always, always. And I listen intently to speakers and teachers and people, even when I say, well, you know that scripture, you know that. No, actually, there's probably some insight here I can gain that will illuminate a little further my understanding, and I think that's so valuable and so important. Joseph Priestley is, and forgive me if you're already well familiar with this fellow and the things I'm going to talk about, but I think for many of you, you will enjoy hearing about this man. He's part of our context, and I think it's helpful to understand about that historical context. He lived quite some time back, and yet the things that he did have had beneficial influence on down the line, and even to folks as Seth Ross was speaking about yesterday some. So I'm calling this Joseph Priestley the American One God Connection, and what's interesting is he was not an American as such. He was an Englishman. And but these Englishmen sometimes bring us good things, don't you think? Just a thought. I thought. So, but anyway, let's see what we can learn about this fellow, and I think it will be helpful to us to see this. Maybe. Oh, here I go. Who was Joseph Priestley? He was an 18th century English scientist, particularly chemist. He was a theologian, a dissenter, and we'll talk about that a little bit. He was an educator and a philosopher, so he was truly a Renaissance fellow, wasn't he, when you think about it? He was really interested in all things that had to do with life and faith and so on. And the picture we have here, I think I've noticed it says 1794, so we'll see that was a little long in his career. He was born in Yorkshire, England in 1733, and he died, interestingly enough, in Pennsylvania, a whole world away from that. And he was 71 years old when he died, so I thought that's interesting. He was the first of 6 children to Jonas Priestley, so we just kind of get a little sketch here of him before we talk more about the things he did. But he was born to Jonas Priestley's first wife, Mary Swift. He was sent to live with his grandfather when he was a year of age. I have a feeling his mother may have been infirmed. She may have had physical maladies, because after he had lived there for 5 years, his mother died. And he went home briefly after that, and his father remarried. But anyway, it wound up he was raised by his aunt and uncle, Sarah and John Keighley, and they were people of means, which actually worked out much to his good, as we'll see. I'm trying. Let me see. I can just do it that way. Yeah, thank you.
Do we know why it's not sliding? Oh, okay. Hold on. Sorry.
Could I do a little soft shoe or something? I was trying to think. Thank you. That really would be a hoot, wouldn't it, as we say in Tennessee?
Do we need to put a slideshow? Yep.
To me, the computer is just like operating a car. I don't know how to fix the transmission, but I just know how to drive, I think. We might be called into question occasionally. We can bring that down to, if we can take it to
Dale,
a show.
That one?
Ah,
There we go.
for goodness sakes. Yeah. Many things. There are many members in the body. We all need each other, don't we? That's good.
How many Unitarians does it take? 3.
Okay. All right. One to watch, which is me. I think that's right. So he was indeed a very brilliant man for his time, and he was a brilliant man for any time, actually, but he did amazing things and was very recognized, I think. And so he was born in Yorkshire, as I mentioned. He died in Pennsylvania, and I won't go back through this information again, but his mother died. He wound up with his aunt and uncle, the Keigleys, and this turned out to be beneficial to him. He married Mary Wilkinson in 1762 when he was 29 years of age, and they had 4 children, a daughter and 3 sons. And so that's the only picture of Mary that I've been able to find. But he was, from a faith standpoint, a dissenter, and that's a large subject that we won't go into, but we'll talk a little bit more about it in a moment. But his background actually was Calvinist in England, and he was educated for the ministry by his aunt. I said they were people of means, and they were able to give him the education that he might not have gotten otherwise, which is very fortunate. He learned Hebrew and Greek, but no, in those days, that would still be a person who was not able to read well. So he also knew Latin well, French, Italian, German, Aramaic, and Arabic. So I think I've got a ways to go to catch up to that. But that's not unusual. Language was so important to them. And so nowadays, if you ever feel a little bit intimidated in the world, go look on like one of these text things or something, and just observe how our youth are writing today, and you'll feel really good about yourself. I think it's just it's an interesting thing. He was educated in the writings of John Locke, and the reason I mention that is this turns out to be very important. John Locke was a Unitarian fellow and also a brilliant man. And he was a political progressive, as it were, for the day, and into this rights of man thing. And John Locke actually was a great influence on people in the States, and particularly Thomas Jefferson and the colonies back in those days. But John Locke's writings about the rights of man, all of us in one way or another have benefited from John Locke's thinking about the idea, the rash idea that government should govern with the assent of the people. And that was a radical thing, because government in those days was the government of the king, or the royalty, as it were, and no one worried about the assent of the people. But now John Locke and others are coming along and saying, no, the people should be what this is all about. And that led to writings in our, for those of you who are from the States, writings in our Declaration of Independence by, in large measure, Thomas Jefferson. And he's actually citing back things that John Locke had planted, if you will, in these things. So very important stuff. He was also educated in the writings of Isaac Watts, who was a Unitarian, though I've not been able to discern for sure. I think he may have had Arian leanings. Here's a problem. If you work in history a little bit, you discover that the language, terms used to refer to people, is not always so well developed. And sometimes you'll find people be called, that's an Arian person. But that's just because that's a popular term to be used for anyone who was not Trinitarian or Orthodox. And in reality, when you begin to look at their actual writings, always look at the first source, if you will, that's best. See what they actually said themselves in their letters and the writings and books and so on. And we discover that actually they weren't actually people who were Arian at all. It's terminology issues. So you always have to make sure your terminology is straight when you come to these things. He left Calvinism, he became a Unitarian, and he graduated from Daventry in 1752, which was a dissenter school. Now let's talk about dissenters for just a moment, because he ministered among the dissenters, he was educated there. But dissenters were, in some ways, we would say political. They were people in England who were thinking, well, church and state really should be separate. And the state should not control or govern what people believe. And so we kind of had that idea going in England. The Calvinists were able to survive there and so on. But we still had the Church of England, what Anthony refers to fondly as the C of E. And the Church of England was a state-approved, the state church, which brought together faith and the crown, right? Sure, that was the idea. Still to this day, you see that bond between the faith and crown in England, though it's not nearly so serious as it used to be. But the dissenters were people who came along and said, that shouldn't be so. From their view, there should be no Church of England. There should just be churches. And everybody, all the churches should sort of compete for the interest of people on a level playing field, as it were. Not because the state is promoting any particular church or perspective. And of course, it was the better idea, but it took time for all that to work out, and it wound up working out better in the States than it had in England, at least for a time there. So that's good. They had something called the Test and Corporations Act passed in England in 1661. And so this was in existence when Priestley was born, when he came on the scene. But that act basically held that dissenters could not hold political office or attend Cambridge or Oxford. I guess they could go to any of those other places, but not Cambridge or Oxford, for goodness sake. And they couldn't serve in the armed services. So that's kind of the picture with Unitarians. They were not liked a lot by the crown, to put it that way. As a Unitarian, Priestley took all of this a step further and was even disliked by his fellow dissenters, mostly because he was Unitarian, and many of them were not. So that's an interesting perspective, I think. His scientific accomplishments, because I said he was a scientist, they're enormous. And in fact, the world knows the name Joseph Priestley, the history of this man, not so much for the reasons we're talking about today and his faith and his Unitarian belief, but they know him for his scientific accomplishments. He was a very extraordinary fellow, very accomplished fellow. So he worked in particularly from 1772 1790 in about an 18-year span. He worked in scientific endeavors. And yes, during that time he discovered and noted 10 new gases. Okay. He became a member of the Royal Society, Scientific Society, with the approval of the king, so hence Royal Society. He discovered nitrous oxide, laughing gas. So if you've ever been to a dentist or something and had them to give you laughing, you can thank Mr. Priestley for that. So he figured that out. This is the most exciting thing, and that is he discovered oxygen. We know the exact date he did because it was such a big deal. August the 1st, 1774. Now, I didn't know oxygen was to be discovered or anything. I just, it's here, we know. But actually, they didn't understand it. They didn't know that. And so, as a consequence, when he did find this and when he did bring this to the attention of all of his fellow scientists, he was a hero. They were like ready to carry him around on their shoulders. So it's a tremendous thing. He laid groundwork for photosynthesis, the way plants, bring sunlight to create energy, and respiration, the interactions between blood and air in mammals and in human beings. So it's great stuff. This perhaps was his most exciting, this next one, his most exciting development during his lifetime, and that is he discovered the idea of carbonation, carbonated water. People loved it. It was just so exciting. They thought this is the greatest thing ever. And actually, in the beginning, they thought it had medicinal properties. So they thought, okay. But if you ever have a soft drink, a Coke or a Pepsi or whatever you like, you need to thank Mr. Priestley. He's the one that developed this carbonation thing. It's a great idea, great thing. So we have to think about him every time we have a soft drink these days, those of you who do that. He was huge in chemistry, so big that in the United States, the Chemical Society of America, their medal, their annual medal given to the most outstanding chemist and so on and that sort of thing, is the Priestley Medal, which they did in 1922, began in 1922. But every year, if you were to go to their association meeting, I don't know why you would probably, but if you did, they were going to give out a medal with our guy's picture on it, and that's exciting. He has, in fact, been by some called the father of chemistry. He really brought chemistry into a new revolution, if you will, a new time. So he was a giant in science of all sorts. This picture I have before you there is a statue of Priestley in Chamberlain Square in Birmingham, England. I don't know if you people have been over around there, have ever seen it, but it's quite an impressive statue. He had over 150 published works, and that's tremendous. Okay. Now back to the really good stuff for us. Okay. He was heterodox, if we can put it that way. He was a Unitarian. He was non-orthodox. He was a one-God believer in the true meaning, significance of that word, those words, one God. So he was a solid one-God guy. We've noted earlier that he came out of Calvinism and came into Unitarianism. We could have followed that history of how that developed, but I don't know that it's so critical. Read up on him more when you get a chance, and if you learn some new things about him, let me know. But he was non-Trinitarian in his views. Only the Father is God. Imagine that. Okay. He wrote a number of important religious writings for the day, and much of what he wrote we could applaud today. So it's very good. He wrote the Institutes, his Institutes. This is not Calvin's, but his Institutes of Natural and Revealed Religion. The fourth part of the Institutes was a very popular thing that he did called An History of the Corruptions of Christianity. He felt like Christianity had problems. Imagine that. So anyway, like John Locke, Priestley leaned toward rationalism. So this is not the happy side of what we want to talk about. He over scriptures at times. He was actually a pretty scriptural guy. He was right on it. But he, as did John Locke and some others of the philosophers, they saw the Unitarian business. And of course, when we say Unitarian, we're not talking about the Unitarian Universalist business, all that. That's another whole different story that came along later. But you see the seeds for that sometimes in this, shall we say, liberal perspective. And this whole business of rationalism. In other words, what I think should reign supreme. Not what the Scripture says, but what I think. So they went along with the Scripture, and they did very well, and Priestley did in great things, and the one God thing had that down pat. And yet, if he saw something that, I don't like that, he said, well, okay, if I don't like it, then we just throw it out. But I'm sure you've never run into anybody like that today. But they had that problem back then, right? Some of them did. And that was something that Priestley did on occasion. So we would have to really sit down and have some talks with him over some of his conclusions then, because it appears, as best I can determine, that he wound up just saying, the virgin birth. He decided he didn't like that, along with John Locke and some others. And so he just threw that out. And the atonement business, which Sean spoke so well about last year at this very conference. But he decided he didn't like the idea that Jesus died for us. Well, it seems to me there's an awful lot of Scripture about these issues, that the better choice would be to say, oh, yes, he did. And we would be more in harmony with the first faith of the first Christians, right? Makes sense. But for them, that was not so. But this is important. He did believe in the resurrection. He did believe in miracles. He did believe in things like that. So he was just, I think he's a guy, I've said this about Jefferson as well, I think he's a guy that we could sit down and talk with and reason with. And maybe we could help him some along a couple of those lines. But but all of these things, his Unitarianism and his being a dissenter, but there was a lot of dissenters, but particularly because he was so good at what he said, he was so good at what he did in his writings and so on, a lot of people decided they did not like Priestley. And in England, they actually got very angry at him, and they burnt him out, literally. Keep in mind, this was good Christian folks that burnt him out. I don't know what the evil people would have done, but the Christians burned him out. So they were very upset because, and the Crown and the authorities did nothing to protect Priestley because they didn't really like him either. Supposedly they did not cause this to happen, but nevertheless they just turned a blind eye to it. To oppose the church was to oppose the state and the king. He supported the American and French revolutions in his thinking and writing, so that was enough to get him in a lot of trouble. And he opposed and wrote against that Test and Corporation Act that did not allow them to go to Harvard. Harvard. They're Harvard over there, okay. Oxford and so on. So, and to have other privileges that you would have as a citizen. So anyway, in 1791, the Priestley riots burned his home, his laboratory, and his church. And he moved from where he was living to near London, but was persuaded by his friends to go on to America. His friends and followers, if you will, just told him, Joseph, they don't like you here. You just got to get that understanding. And so he did. He departed for America. I think that was very interesting. In 1794. So the Priestley riots, you could probably look it up and find it in some sources. That's when they burned him out and all of this. It's even notable in history. This is a painting of that I found. On the other hand, Joseph Priestley was celebrated in America. Here they liked both his political views and his rights of man ideas and his religious writings were all of great interest. They actually listened to him. And I think that's amazing. He went to America when he was about 61 years old, and remember, he died when he was 71, so about 10 years. The last 10 years of his life he lived in America. Wound up settling in Pennsylvania, and I think his children there. I've not been able to discern for sure. I know he had at least one son who was with him there. He had a lot of previous personal connections while he was still in England. Benjamin Franklin was his buddy. So they got along famously. Of course, Benjamin Franklin, one of the exciting characters of the day and a great scientist in himself. But he had met, Priestley and Franklin had met in 1765. Franklin is the one that convinced Priestley to write a very famous scientific book, The History of Electricity. Now that's something to think about. But Franklin had significant influence on Priestley's practical science approach. And he'd also met John Adams. I haven't been able to figure out when, whether it was before the Revolution or after, when Adams was in England as the first ambassador to England from the United States after the Revolution. He did not originate Unitarian faith in America. We know that John Adams, when we study on him a bit, he was a lifelong churchgoer. He was a member of Braintree's First Parish Church. That's Quincy, Massachusetts, I think now. But the church changed from Congregationalist doctrine to a Unitarian one in the mid-1750s. The church subscribed to Unitarian beliefs for 75 years before formally separating. I got all that off of PBS. Isn't that exciting? On something about John Adams. But hence the Braintree Church, depending on how you figure out what the PBS people were saying, may have been Unitarian all the way back into the late 1600s. I don't know. We'll have to work on that. He benefited American Unitarianism greatly, though, and he affected Thomas Jefferson, which is another whole story and presentation. Jefferson became solidly Unitarian in his faith, whatever else we may say about it. He did believe that the unity of God was the correct understanding of these things. So that's great. Jefferson wrote, I have read his, speaking of Priestley, his corruptions of Christianity and early opinions of Jesus over and over again, and I rest on them. In fact, they are the basis of my own faith. Well, how exciting. I'd rather that my basis of faith would be like Peter's words and Paul's words, but still, he was doing okay here, I guess, going this way. However, Jefferson also leaned into and even beyond Priestley's rationalist tendencies, and he took liberties with the Scriptures, dismissing the virgin birth, the atonement, and the resurrection. Though I've studied Jefferson a lot, I've worked on a series, some of you may have seen or heard, called Our 5, maybe 6, One God, Unitarian, United States Presidents. And I think it's exciting. I just found it interesting and pursued it some as almost a hobby. But I think it's really interesting things for us. Well, Jefferson was greatly spoken about, written about, discussed, and I think in many ways misunderstood, not entirely, but some, in our world today. And I'm not going to talk about him at this moment, but Jefferson actually, at the end of his life, I keep trying to understand it, he had a very strong conviction that there was life after this life. He would tell you he was a Christian. He did believe in Jesus. He would tell you today he was not a deist, as is so often said. He didn't believe that, and we know that by his writings that went on in time. But anyway, as I say, another story for another time, and that's Thomas Jefferson. But he was Unitarian by the latter days of his life, no question about it. And Priestley influenced him a great deal in that, I think. Priestley likely influenced Franklin. Franklin was very quiet regarding his religion. You can't, I've researched a bit. Maybe some of you will find more than I have been able to find. If you do, let me know. But I think Franklin he was not that wasn't his calling in life as he saw it. And he doesn't have a lot to say about his personal faith or religion. He just didn't write about it, didn't talk about it. But we do know that he was a personal friend of Priestley's, who was a Unitarian minister. And we also know that Franklin attended church with Priestley in America. And so there was a lot of connection. The nearest thing I've been able to find on this point about Franklin and his faith, and the possibility that he was really with us on this one God business as well, is this statement actually made by one of our United States presidents that came along later, and who was actually also the head justice, if you will, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for a while, and that's William Howard Taft. And he said this in 1917 about Franklin. He says, "It was not always so. Jefferson, though a sincere student of the teachings of Jesus and a Unitarian, was denounced as an atheist," which he never was an atheist, I think, period. We know the contumely, insult, and mob violence to which Priestley was subjected in England. Okay. And he says, Franklin, the Adamses, both John Adams and John Quincy Adams, he said, and Fillmore, who was a later United States president, he said they were all Unitarians. So it's a very interesting history that we pick up there. So Ben Franklin, we've got the Ben Franklin connection here through Priestley, and I do believe that it's possible then that Ben Franklin actually, if you'd said, Ben, what do you think about all this? Is God three or is he one? I have a feeling if you could have gotten to talk about it, he would have said, oh, obviously he's just one. There's only one who is God. So Priestley contributed to a strengthening of Unitarianism in America and the growth of it, and various new Unitarian churches, including a new church in Philadelphia, were the result of Priestley's preachings in those places. Harvard University, some people don't realize this, became for a time basically a Unitarian institution, perhaps the foremost educational institution in America, we might say, historically certainly. And it was in the early 1800s that was the case, and I think Priestley certainly had some effect on all of that as well. Jefferson made this statement. He said, I have no doubt that the whole of our country will soon be rallied to the unity of the Creator. And so he's saying, this is such a wonderful and great truth. Everybody is going to get on board with this. He just said, I just believe that's going to be the case. Well, that didn't exactly work out. But nevertheless, I think Jefferson would be happy and Priestley would be happy to know that we're here today. And we're still rejoicing in this understanding that God is one. And that God is the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Messiah. So, but interesting stuff, I think. John Quincy Adams, who by the way is my favorite of all those early Unitarian guys. He was a really strong biblical fellow. In fact, he was the president of the American Bible Society for quite some time. But John Quincy Adams, he saw and opposed the trend in Unitarianism toward rationalism. So what I'm saying here today is kind of important. You may have observed in life that we have folks around out here who call themselves Unitarian, sometimes Universalist, sometimes Unitarian Universalist, and they're really not us. They're just off on a whole different trip. But it's nice to go back and say, where did that come from? How did that get to be here? And what are these people doing calling themselves Unitarians? Well, the word Unitarian was actually a pretty good word, I think, and it was the significance and the meaning of it in the beginning was great. And it didn't mean, it was just, we are Unitarian as opposed to Trinitarian. That was the objective, what they were trying to say. But it's like the word later on got hijacked by those who were of the liberal bent. I talked to Kent Ross about this one time and interviewed him about it. And he said, yeah, it was like the hijacking of a whole idea. They took off with it. They didn't really want to stay true to the idea that God is one. But they took the name, and they added it in with universalism, and then in the 60s we came up with the UUs. I'm not saying that disparagingly. They refer to themselves as UUs, Unitarian Universalists, okay? But that's not us at all. I went, one time in my life, I went into a Unitarian church, and it wasn't anything going on. I just went in there and spoke with a couple of ladies, and one was the minister of the church. And it was interesting to talk with her, and I said, well, have you, this is UU, okay. And she's telling me all about her church, and yes, we have a Buddhist who speaks here periodically, and we have another man, and she said we even have I don't know in that church, but in some churches we have people who are Satan folks, and said we let them speak. I thought, okay. I said, well, have you ever heard of biblical Unitarianism? And the minister thought, and she said, no. She said, wouldn't that be a contradiction in terms? Okay, so you see where this went. If you're going to divorce yourself from the Bible, the foundation of what Sean was speaking about last night, if you're going to let go of that, then what do you have? It doesn't really much matter, does it? It's just what everybody wants to think, what you like. And there was a touch of that among some of these people, including the fellow we're talking about today. I don't think I want to dismiss the good that he did and the good things he did, and same would go for Jefferson. But I really like John Quincy Adams and his position on all these things. He saw what they were doing, Priestley and Jefferson. He strongly rejected Joseph Priestley's materialism and ultra-rationalism, just as he was later to oppose the transcendentalism of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great Emerson that you probably all studied. If you're an American, you've studied in high school. But and Browning or Brownson, calling them, get this, vipers and enemies of public virtue. So I don't know what we would think about that, Sean. They might need a little work on that, getting along while we talk things out business. But John Quincy Adams was so terribly just drawn about this issue of them bringing in liberal perspectives and dismissing Scripture, that he couldn't say enough. I've got this quote, but he said many other things about it. So he just went to town. He wrote against that. Even though obviously Ralph Waldo Emerson and certainly Priestley, these were venerable people in so many respects. But when it came to these issues, John Quincy Adams gave them no quarter. He was just determined. He really just came down. They were, to him, he said, they're vipers and enemies of public virtue. He's trying to make a point. But to Adams, Emerson's Divinity School address, those of you who are familiar with that was a big moment in the development, the beginnings of perhaps the more liberal Unitarian view that we now know as UUism, if you will. And some determined that it meant that universalism was correct. All this stuff. Anyway, but John Quincy Adams said that that was just crazy. He said all this stuff is crazy. By the way, there's some question that Ralph Waldo Emerson actually meant some of the things that he was later said to have meant by that address. But he said it was crazy, and Brownson was an advocate of self-delusive atheism. So I don't know, this John Quincy Adams was just spent over this issue. But there are others who did well. John Quincy Adams, very biblical guy. You could read some of his writings along these lines, and his mother's writings. Beautiful stuff. Abigail, his mom. You would have loved this woman. You could have sat down with her and just spoke with her liberally, and she would be talking to you some of the same scriptures that we so rejoice in and love today. So she was wonderful. And then John Quincy Adams was right in there with her. John Adams, the dad, if you will, is a little more difficult to figure out some of the story with him. He was so political. Most of his life is dedicated to political issues, but he was a one-God believer, no question about it. And he and Jefferson actually got together after having been lifelong enemies nearly. They got together in their later lives and became friends. And this is part of what brought them together, this belief that God is only one. So it's exciting stuff going on. But I mentioned here Benjamin Wilson, John Wilson. There were many others in the 1800s and the 1850s perhaps. And then I mentioned here the Church of God General Conference, represented by Seth Ross last night so well. But they came out of this, shall we say, true Unitarian perspective and Unitarian move, held this up. And today, I've been asked this, that if I was to say who best represents the true Unitarian tradition of those early people, the Rockow people, the Polish brethren and all that, out of the Reformation, who were one God people and ready to give their lives for that. Who represents it best today? I can say as a group, I think the Church of God General Conference does that the best of any group that we've got out here. And for that, I'm greatly appreciative. They don't pay me anything to say that, but I really believe it. If I didn't believe it, I just wouldn't say it. But I think it's very true. And so that's a great thing and a great heritage that's carried by this wonderful group, and I appreciate it so much. Priestley lived out his life, his 10 years in America. He came to America in 1794. Mary died in 1796, 2 years later. He lived with his oldest son, Joseph Jr., and his daughter-in-law until he died in 1804. This is a picture of his home in Pennsylvania, which is a national landmark in America. Isn't that interesting? But not because he was one of us, but rather because of all his amazing scientific achievements. So that's tremendous. Priestley believed that his most valuable works were his theological ones, because he said in one time, he said they were of superior dignity and superior importance. So I think that's great. This, you'll enjoy this epitaph. His epitaph reads, "Return unto thy rest, O my soul, for the Lord hath dealt bountifully with thee. I will lay me down in peace and sleep till I wake in the morning of the resurrection." So the last words we have regarding Priestley, if you are a person who is a conditionalist, as I am, this is really remarkable, isn't it? And so he even understood this particularly significant issue and important, at least by the time he died. That's where he was at. And I have a book. This is amazing. It's called Disquisitions, but this is some of the writings of Priestley. You're welcome to look at it if you will, would like to. Relating to matter and spirit. But this, I've got to say this, and it might be worth getting this book for this very reason. There's a second writing involved here, but it's called The History of the Philosophical Doctrine Concerning the Origin of the Soul and the Nature of Matter with its Influence on Christianity. Especially, now listen to this, especially with the respect to the doctrine of the pre-existence of Christ. So Priestley saw something that perhaps a lot of folks hadn't thought that much about. That the whole idea of Jesus pre-existing is somehow related, he thinks, made possible by the idea of the nature of man being dual and the pre-existent soul business of Jesus then. It's just, he says, pre-existence of Christ kind of goes away once we understand he's a man and we understand what man is. So anyway, for those of you with an interest in that, he's got a whole writing in here about it, and if you can make your way through a lot of long words, then think a little bit like someone would have written a while back. And also those S's. anyone who ever reads this old language stuff, they had more ways to make S's than the person needs. It just doesn't matter. But then I did think, though, in Greek, Koine Greek at least, they had at least two ways that they made the S's, whether it was at the end of the word or not. So, but anyway, and that's all I have to say about that man. What do you think?
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
All right, so if there are any questions, you know the drill. There's a mic stand there. And Jeremy, let's see. So after the questions, we'll have a very brief break so we can change the mics and stuff. You got a question?
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Dan.
Yeah.
Is this on?
No.
Turn it on.
Switch on.
Keep pressing it until you see green.
Hello? Okay. Thanks, that was really interesting. Just a couple of recommendations about
Yes.
chemistry for everybody. You have to be careful with him. He's not as good at history as he is at chemistry. He does make some mistakes.
Okay.
If you want to read more of him, if you go to lulu.com,
Oh.
and search Joseph Priestley, I've reprinted a couple of his theological
Okay.
books,
Yes.
some tracts and the history of corruptions.
And those are available?
Yeah.
Great.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
They're reprints of older editions.
Excellent. Yes.
About this whole issue of the downfall of American Unitarianism is a really interesting subject.
Mhm.
And that famous address that Emerson gave,
Yes.
the place to look for the refutation of that is a major guy named Andrews Norton, who's a biblical Unitarian.
Yes.
And this talk is called The New Species of Infidelity.
Okay.
That's as well.
They always had a way with words, didn't they?
There's another book called American Heretic,
Okay.
which is a biography of this famous preacher named Theodore Parker.
Of course. Yes.
And Theodore Parker kind of personally went from being a biblical Unitarian to being a who knows what.
Yes.
And it's a very good book. It traces a lot of these controversies.
Excellent.
It's a big tragedy, really. It was a missed opportunity
Right.
for American Christians.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a derailment, I think. Yeah. And as Kent Ross said, kind of the hijacking of a religion back then. So, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Del. Do we have one more? Then we'll have a quick break. Thank you.
Hey, Dan.
Indeed.
Thank
Thank
I
you.
want to know, was there a connection between his beliefs on conditional immortality and his scientific advancements? Did he find those two things connected?
In the book, Disquisitions, if you're like me, you don't know what a disquisition is, right? I had to go look that up. It's not everyday language for me anyway. But, the nearest thing I could find is kind of like a dissertation of sorts, okay? But anyway, in this, he talks about your very question. And it's kind of long and a bit labored, but if you have a lot of patience and you don't mind wading through a lot of sort of Old English, sort of, he'll explain to you the answer to your question. And he does. He feels like there's a connection, a relationship between his view of man and that scientific picture and the Bible and its view of God, or of man as he saw it. Okay. Yeah.
All right, so thank you, Pastor Gill.
Indeed.
Yeah. So we'll take a quick break. There is coffee and tea and drinks out there all day, I think. So we'll do a quick break and come back for Dr.
Aha.